Okay, welcome back. I'm going to continue with the section on drugs, and there's some terms that I want you to be familiar with in the PowerPoint here. The PowerPoint screen is called terminology and the four terms. Some of this I think you already know. Expect it in the body of the question just so you understand the vocabulary of it. Some of it there may be a question specifically about the term. So the first one is tolerance. So tolerance is when it takes a greater amount of drug to produce the same effect that it initially produced. So you develop tolerance. Your body tries to counteract the drug, and by doing that, you have to put more of that substance to get the same effect. And over time, there are just some drugs that you develop tolerance for. So a teenager who might drink some alcohol and get drunk on not very much, if they were to continue consuming alcohol over periods of time and develop tolerance, it would take more and more of whatever they're drinking to get the same effect. That's what happens to heroin addicts. They develop a tolerance very quickly and they have to continue to take more and more. The next term that I see there is physical dependence. Physical dependence is a polite way of saying addiction. And so if there's physical dependence, it means that your body has become dependent on it. It's physiological. And if you don't have it, you're going to start having symptoms like headaches or nausea or tremors, something like that. So an example might be, let's take a common thing like caffeine. So as you develop tolerance for caffeine, you're going to drink more and more of whatever it is. Could be a soda, could be coffee. Well, if you skip a day or two and you don't get your caffeine at the levels that you've been consuming it, then you're going to feel that because you become dependent on it. If it's a stimulant, which it is, then it keeps you alert, awake, and so on. Well, you're going to become drowsy and lethargic, if you will, probably have headaches, but it's always going to be something physiological. Well, when you talk about physical dependence, then you also have to talk about withdrawal, which is the third term, and that's the intense craving, pain and craving for the drug. So withdrawal is always going to follow physical dependence when you don't consume the substance at the level you've been consuming it. And so those headaches I was talking about, drowsy, nausea, tremors, those would be examples of withdrawal. Physical dependence is the actual dependence that you have on the substance that led to the withdrawal when you don't have it. And then finally, the author talks about psychological dependence. And so now we're not talking physiological, we're talking psychological or cognitive. But are you dependent on it? Not physically dependent on it, but you are psychologically dependent on it. So a good way to say this in layman's terms would be it's a coping mechanism for you. You're stressed out, you have a drink or you smoke a cigarette and it calms you back down. That's your coping strategy. Instead of doing yoga or visualization or exercise, you're turning to some sort of substance to help you deal with whatever distresses you're experiencing. And they call that psychological dependence. So as far as the test question, it's not going to be about the substance itself. It's going to be about the reason the person takes the substance. So if you see an example of someone who drinks a few glasses of wine because they've been invited to a party and they don't know anyone except the person that invited them, they're uncomfortable in new surroundings and around strangers, so they have a few drinks before they go to the party. That would be psychological dependence. They're not drinking the alcohol because they're addicted to alcohol. They're drinking it to reduce their anxiety and stress so they can go and participate in this party. So don't pay so much attention to the substance as much as the reason they're taking the substance. For instance, cigarettes, you might be addicted to cigarettes, but if you were stopped by the police and you're nervous, you might ask, can I have a cigarette? Not because your body's going through withdrawal, but because you're used to smoking a cigarette, it calms you down. And that would be psychological dependence compared to taking something because you're going through physiological discomfort. Okay? So make sure you know those four terms. A couple other things here is that when it comes to all these substances I'm going to be talking about, make sure you can categorize them. And there's only three categories. One is stimulants, one is depressants, and one is hallucinogenic. To keep it simple, let me just tell you that the depressants and the stimulants, you're always going to experience withdrawal. They are physically addictive substances or physically dependent substances. The hallucinogenic drugs are going to be more like the psychological dependence. And we'll get into that shortly. Okay, well, trends in overall drug use. The problem with this section is the information is only as good as the answers that people are willing to give you. So what I mean by that basically is you're going to see in the chapter that overall there's been a decline in drug use among young people. Well, they don't know that that's necessarily accurate because typically if you're going to survey or interview young people, you have to go to where young people are, and the mass of young people are in school. And again, when you're looking at substance abuse, alcohol, and so on, as kids get older, they're more likely to experiment with these things. So typically you're going to be more likely to be doing this work in high school settings. Well, the problem with going to the high schools is that, number one, I talked about chronic runaways in the last chapter. A lot of these runaway kids who are doing drugs are not even in the school, so you can't even interview or survey them, so you're not getting that information. Then the kids who are in school that are answering your interview questions or surveys, they may be less than forthcoming because they're not likely just to admit that they're doing drugs because they're going to get in trouble for that. And so it's difficult to get accurate information is the point. And so while it says there's a decrease, you have to kind of take that with a grain of salt and assume that there's a lot of levels of use that we don't know about because they're simply not going to be forthcoming. Now, if we're going to look at the overall trend, though, what we do know that's pretty accurate is beginning about in the 60s and through the 70s, there was a major increase in drugs in our country, and especially in the use of marijuana and cocaine and LSD and some of those drugs. And then supposedly because of all the different steps we took, like the Just Say No to Drugs and the DARE campaigns and some of the other things that came along, and it became not so cool to do drugs. You know, for a while there it was kind of the thing to do, but then it became a little more stigmatized, and so people were less likely to say they were doing drugs, and so the numbers, whether accurate or not, kind of started dropping. And just keep that in mind. So it's a very difficult subject to measure the level of drug use in our country. But having said that, we are the leading consumers of, well, I'll say illicit drugs. Be sure you know the difference between illicit and licit. Illicit drug would be the cocaine, rock, crack cocaine, and heroin, ecstasy, and some of the others. Licit drugs would be prescription drugs, perfectly legal drugs prescribed by a physician, obviously. But in either case, we lead the world in the consumption of drugs, and that's true even among our young people. Well, there it is, the trends of overall drug use in the United States. So I have it right there for you. And so pay attention to that. Well, I want to talk about 447 at the top. I want to make sure I'm where you are so we're together and you can follow me in the book, or at least make a note of where we are in the book. Before the author gets into the things that we think of as drugs like cocaine and heroin and so on, there's a discussion of alcohol. Well, the alcohol, anything you take that's going to modify your mood, you're trying to use it to cope for whatever reasons you use it, you're putting it in your system, is we're going to call substance abuse in general. But specifically in talking about alcohol, let's discuss some reasons why kids do alcohol and the level of use in alcohol. So as usual, I'm always going to try to give you some little tips that get you ready for the test. There's going to be 2 or 3 different questions on the test that are going to sound very similar, and that's about what is the most common or prevalent drug and or substance that kids take. You have to be careful because the question is going to be very specific. So since we're talking about alcohol, I'm just going to say, look at the first statement here in this PowerPoint under alcohol. It says the most widely used drug by adolescents. The most widely used, meaning the most common. Well, you go, okay, that's easy to remember. But you have to be careful. It's not the most widely used on a daily basis. It's just the most widely used generally speaking. And the reason for that is kids that drink alcohol, generally speaking, binge drink. And binge drinking is consuming a certain amount of alcohol in a shorter period of time, and typically they'll do that on the weekends. And so they tend to binge drink. And that's the number one substance that they go for. Now, why? And they believe the reason for that is the accessibility. It's easier to get. People have alcohol in their homes. It's a legal substance. You can purchase it, just not legal for minors. But since it's legal and people have it, then kids can get it pretty easily. And so it doesn't carry the same stigma as being a heroin addict or a crackhead or something like that. Okay? Now, when it comes to gender and some of the problems that are a spin-off of alcohol, I think the PowerPoint will tell you that at 65% or about 2/3 of instances of domestic violence in the home is going to be results of males consuming alcohol, becoming drunk, and then becoming violent within the home. And so that should tell you something about the consumption of alcohol by gender, that males are far more likely to consume higher volumes of alcohol compared to females, and far more males drink than do females. So it is a bigger issue for males than females. And again, this is all just general statements. There's always exceptions. The last thing, and by the way, when you're studying these substances, always study the category of the substance, whether it's a depressant, a stimulant, or hallucinogenic. Study whether it's psychological dependence or physical dependence and so on. And so keep these things in mind, and symptoms. And so on the PowerPoint it talks about alcohol is a depressant. Underline that. No matter what the scenario tells you, I don't care how it makes the person feel, they're getting loud, they're singing, they're dancing, and it seems like they're being stimulated. That's what it seems like. But that's not what it actually is, because as you consume more of it, eventually it begins to work on your central nervous system. A depressant is something that's going to slow down your central nervous system. So a person continues to consume alcohol, I guarantee you their speech is going to become slurred and slowed down. Their ability to walk even, be alert and quick. And if you consume enough of it, you can pass out. And if you consume way too much of it, you can actually stop breathing and die from alcohol poisoning. And so don't be tricked by any choices except that alcohol acts as a depressant on your system. That's the bottom line. Now, as far as young people, let me say that There's some research that says that if kids start drinking in high school, then if they go on to college, they're more than likely, almost guaranteed really, to increase their level of drinking than they were doing prior to. So if they leave high school and they've already begun drinking and they go to college, they're probably going to drink even more. The author says that about 50% of college students have a real problem with alcohol. They're heavy drinkers, which leads to other problems, of course, of getting in trouble with the law, skipping class, failing grades, accidents, and so on. And so it can be a real problem, but unfortunately in universities it's seen as a cultural thing. In fact, it's seen as a cultural period. We live in Louisiana, where we have festivals for everything. We have festivals because we have rice. We have festivals because we have rabbits. We have festivals down in Cameron because we got rats down there, and we have a wildlife festival. And well, guess what happens at festivals? People drink. And then young people are around it, and it's cultural, and they drink because they learn this is how you have fun. And so two of the biggest predictors of kids engaging in consumption of alcohol will be, again, their peers, especially if their peers are older and consuming, and, believe it or not, family. And so those are the two big influences of any of our lives, are our friends and our family. And so if you come from a family in which alcohol is common and culturally it's socially accepted, lots of parties, getting together, family reunions and things like that, and that's what people do, that's what kids learn. So it can certainly be a predictor. And that is on a PowerPoint headed up, risk factors called family and peer pressure. So keep that in mind, the page on alcohol, again, on page 447. The next category that I see on page 449 is the category of drugs called hallucinogenic drugs. Now, hallucinogenic drugs are drugs that modify perception and create or produce hallucinations. Those are actually two different things, but I want you to keep that in mind. And while I'm thinking about it, I'm seeing page 442 has all this information for you by category, separated by category, whether it's psychological or physical dependence, and some of the symptoms you'd be looking for and so on. So it's a real good place to study. Anyway, back to the hallucinogenic drugs. Well, perception is what you believe to be true. And so if you're modifying your perception, you're doing some sort of drug, and then you believe that if you're a musician or an artist or a poet, that you're more creative and you do your best work when you're under this substance, under the influence of the substance. That's your perception. Unfortunately, the perception is not necessarily the reality. And so you may be doing no better work than you would do if you were completely sober and not under the influence. A drug is not going to make you more creative. You either are creative or you aren't. The drug's not going to make you more creative. But it seems that way, and that's the perception. The hallucinogenic side, though, is something even more serious, and this is where you see things or hear things that aren't real. They're not there, but you believe that they're real. And so hallucinogenic drugs, if they cause these hallucinations, are very much like a psychotic break from reality. Well, an example would be hallucinating that you have bugs crawling all over you. Hallucinating that you can now fly. And unfortunately, people actually had these types of beliefs back in the 60s, and they'd go climb on tops of buildings and leap off thinking they were going to fly, because they actually were hallucinating. And so it can be quite dangerous. So anyway, let's look at these drugs. The author covers here. The first paragraph talks about LSD, quite common in the 60s. It's really a form of what we would call acid. There's a picture here in your PowerPoint of a little bitty stamp. That stamp probably has 1 drop of acid. Now, go say, well, what is acid? Well, that's just a street slang for some synthetic concoction that somebody's come up with. And by the way, you could have questions about the origin of drugs, whether they're organic or synthetic. Synthetic drugs are almost always going to be more dangerous because you don't know what chemicals someone has put in there, and LSD was one of those. And so people put all sorts of chemicals together to get this hallucinogenic effect, thinking it was going to be this wild, pleasurable, psychedelic experience. And by the way, that's another good test-taking tip, is if you see hallucinogenic drugs are also known as, you pick psychedelic. Psychedelic means mind-altering. You're seeing things that aren't there. Well, go back to why people take drugs. Well, you want to have some sort of pleasurable experience and escape reality for a while. But unfortunately with LSD, because of the various chemicals, dangerous chemicals really, people are having horrible experiences and terror types of experiences, and spiders crawling on them, and just terrible things, and night terror. And what they found with the LSD, even when people stopped taking it, they continued to have night terrors. And so the use of it really dropped off after a number of years. There was a slight resurgence in it later of new generations of people coming along, but basically the drug lost its popularity because it was not doing what people wanted, which was to have this wonderful psychedelic experience. They were actually sometimes having horrible experiences. And it primarily, again, is more hallucinogenic than the other drug listed in this category, and that's, the author has the marijuana listed under the hallucinogenic drug, primarily because of it alters perception, not so much the hallucinogenic effect. Now, as far as origins, it's organic, whereas the LSD is 100% synthetic. But just because a drug is organic, it simply grows from a plant, doesn't mean it doesn't have chemicals added. Most everything does. And so you still have to be careful with that. So when people talk about risk factors and it's not dangerous, it is to the degree that you don't know what other chemicals have been added to enhance taste, flavor, or effect. And so I do want you to pay attention to what causes the altered perception when it comes to marijuana, and that is tetrahydrocannabinol. Simply, probably on the test, you'll just see THC. It's the active ingredient that causes the altered perception. Both of these drugs, since they fall under the category of hallucinogenic drugs, you're not going to experience physical dependence. So you're not going to really experience any physiological withdrawal, discomfort. But people do become dependent on them, so you very likely could find yourself using marijuana as a psychological dependent substance, in which that's how you cope. That's how you calm yourself down. You're feeling overwhelmed or stressed. That's what a lot of the kids tell us in this program, that use drugs because they're stressed out, and it counters that stress. And so just kind of keep that in mind. I'm kind of going a little over time here because I really want to make sure I get this information to you. As a reminder, we're heading quickly towards the final, and so I'll stop at this point for now, and I'll do another, probably 2 more on Wednesday for you. So good luck.